a lot going on in the news that I want to get to. But first, we have an opportunity to have Kate Raworth on the program. She's got a new book out, Doughnut Economics, which I'm about 2/3 through reading, and it's just an extraordinary book. She's a senior visiting research associate at Oxford University's Environmental Change Institute, senior associate with the Cambridge Institute for Sustainable Leadership. Her website, Kate Raworth, KateRaworth.com, and you can tweet her at Kate Raworth. And Kate, welcome to the program.
Oh, thanks, Tom. It's great to be on.
Thanks so much for joining us. One of the things, in addition to the little YouTube that you've got about, the origin of neoliberalism, was the material in your book about this whole meeting at Mont, if I'm saying that right. I spent years on this program decrying the neoliberalism, the neoliberal turn that America took under the Reagan administration and the UK with Thatcher. And also, frankly, the Democratic Party's embrace of neoliberalism with third way DLC, economic and internationalist policies. And but I never really understood or knew this origin story, this birth story. Can you tell us that story of where did neoliberalism, even the word itself, come from?
Yeah, well, it is true for so many things, isn't it, Tom? We live by theories of economics that we don't actually know where they come from, and it's best to dig out the origins and find out. So almost exactly 70 years ago, in April 1947, a little band of economists met in a little Swiss village called Mont because they wanted to write a new story, a new narrative of economics that would promote the economics they believed in. They were, let's be fair to them, they were afraid of the rise of totalitarian states that they saw going on in the Soviet Union. And they wanted to create an alternative narrative to that. And they called it themselves neoliberalism. Their defining belief was that if you give the state an inch, it will take a mile. In fact, it will swallow up the whole economy. And therefore, you can't let the state play any role at all. You need to minimize the state. What happened, though, was this idea that they had, and let's be fair, it was back in the 1940s, very different times from where we are today. But their push back against state totalitarianism quickly turned into a push for market fundamentalism, and the idea that the market is efficient, it promotes freedom. Who could be against that? And so you should give the market free rein. Now, they came up with that in the 1940s. It didn't get put into practice in the 1940s. In fact, it waited in the wings for decades until politicians looking for a big new story, coming out the 70s when everything ran aground, were ready for a new story. And Reagan was surrounded by members of the Mont Pelerin Society that had grown up. Mrs. Thatcher in the UK, well, her first chancellor was a member of the Mont Pelerin Society. And so when they came to power together at the same time at the beginning of the 1980s, they put this story on the international stage. And it's the story that our lives have been run by for the last 40 years.
In the United States, the United Kingdom, and arguably the EU, the restrictions that the EU put on governments being able to engage in fiscal stimulus, and of course the absolute destruction of their ability to engage in monetary policy by surrendering their currency. These are all aspects of this neoliberal agenda, are they not?
That's right. And the thing that's happened is that the story became so dominant, we don't even realize. It's like fish in the water, right? And so many of the left-wing parties, if we want to still call them that, took on this approach because it seemed to be the only one on offer, right? Thatcher says there is no alternative, and every side started being just a shade of difference of neoliberalism. So now we have in trade agreements, the idea that companies can sue governments if they in any way threaten or undermine the profits that they expected to make. I mean, it's an extraordinary triumph of the power of corporates and the power of the market, apparently, over the role of the state to be a protection and a promoter of people and the well-being of the living world.
Yeah. Now, there has been some pushback to this. For example, just looking at these trade agreements, and well, actually, first, just to clarify, then, the fundamental ideas of neoliberalism, you list essentially 7 of them, or 7 categories in the introduction in the first part of your book, and then you go through them in more depth throughout the book. You want to quickly summarize what are the core tenets of neoliberalism beyond the one that you just mentioned, which is that the government can do no right, and the free market can do no wrong. So all power should go to the corporations and billionaires and should be taken away from the governments, essentially. Correct me if I'm misstating.
Yeah, that's right. Well, in my book, and I've tried to make my book very playful because being playful is sometimes the best way of being disruptive. I've drawn up what I think is the script of the neoliberal play that we've been living by. And sometimes if you describe the characters in the play and you load the description of the character with so much such traits that it's obvious how the script is going to run, and the story almost writes itself. And so Milton Friedman was really the master storyteller in this. And he was funny, which is a brilliant attribute to have, because when people laugh, they start to warm to your ideas. So he essentially wrote the story that the market is efficient. We've all heard about the market efficiency. And so therefore, we should give it free rein, right? If the market is efficient, let it do its thing. Business is innovative, so we should let it lead. Finance, we were told, was infallible. The markets will always take into account all information. So trust in their ways, trust the financial markets, and that really was
trust the banksters.
Message we had until trust the bankers. They are taking account of all information. The price of the stocks are never wrong. They've taken account of all available information. You can't win against the market. Trade, win-win, right? We all know trade is win-win. So therefore, you should open your borders. And the state was deemed incompetent. And Friedman was brilliant at this. He'd say things like, you put the government in charge of the Saharan desert and there'd be a scarcity of sand within a few years. And that's funny, but that doesn't make it true.
Yeah.
So these were the characters of the story. But there are a bunch of other characters also that weren't even required on the stage because they were marginalized in the neoliberal story. So we've got the household, all that unpaid caring work of cooking, shopping, sweeping, cleaning up, raising the kids. All that was just seen as domestic, so we can leave it to the women and not consider it as part of the economy because it doesn't add to GDP. We've got the commons, and every economic student has heard of the idea of the tragedy of the commons, that if people share a resource, they'll inevitably destroy it and run it down.
Yeah, Garrett Harding.
Under that framing, yeah, Garrett Harding, right? If the commons are tragic, well, you should sell them off, privatize them so we can look after them properly, apparently. Society, Thatcher told us, there is no such thing as society. Well, if there's no such thing as society, we can ignore it. And Earth was... Don't worry if we have a shortage of copper or any kind of minerals. We'll always use them to find substitutes. So don't worry about that. The market will take care of that.
This was Julian Simon's famous bet with Paul Ehrlich, which he actually won. But in any case, yes.
Exactly.
So this is the neoliberal narrative, and it is, in the United States, it was embraced full on by the Republican Party and Reagan. The Democratic Party has been kind of schizophrenic about it, and I think the same is true of Labour in the UK. In the UK, Tony Blair embraced this with New Labour, and I would argue it bit him in the butt. In the United States, Bill Clinton embraced it to a large extent, but the Democratic Party itself, by and large, didn't. The Democratic Party, at least up until recently, and frankly, I think it's starting to go back to its roots. Every single one of the trade deals that was passed, the Korean Free Trade Agreement, the NAFTA, every single one of them was passed with majority Republican support in the House and Senate and majority Democratic opposition in the House and Senate. So the Democrats never really bought into that part of it. The Democrats, in many regards, when Bill Clinton said the era of big government is over, there was a lot of pushback from a lot of Democrats when he, quote, reformed welfare so that you couldn't be on for more than 5 years, assuming that we would never have a recession that lasted more than 5 years. A lot of Democrats pushed back on that. And now the Democratic Party, particularly the so-called Sanders wing of it, seems to be wholesale rejecting neoliberalism. And I'm seeing the same thing coming out of the UK with Jeremy Corbyn, I believe. Are you seeing? Do you think that that's a reasonable analysis, first of all? And secondly, I know in your book you offer some extraordinary, alternatives to not only neoliberalism but also the general macroeconomic model that we've been using. But where do you think we're going with all this?
So I think that the pushback and coming often from people is that we're told this story and it's been the only story on offer, and yet we feel insulted by the effects of it, and people experience that in their lives. So on the trade agreements, I think we're often, because the idea of trade being win-win, we're often told that trade agreements are about deals between countries opening up borders. In fact, more and more, they've been about companies versus governments and increasing that corporate power over the government, again, the market over the state. I think the rise of Sanders in this country and the support from many behind Jeremy Corbyn shows there is such a strong desire for an alternative story, not just what Blair did as a third way. Can we marry these two? Can we, pull neoliberalism in a slightly nicer direction? But a different story that starts with a script placed in a completely different place. Because if you, Bucky Fuller, right? Buckminster Fuller had such a wonderful quote. He said, "You don't change things by criticizing the existing model. If you want to change it, you create a new model that makes the existing one obsolete." And so we need more than just tweaking on the edges of neoliberalism. We need to start again and put purpose at the heart of the economy and ask ourselves, what is an economy for? And what would it look like to create an economy that actually could deliver that? And I think the clarity, say, of Bernie Sanders, when he speaks, he goes back to things that people fundamentally value: healthcare, education, justice, equality. And people respond so much to that because I think there's a craving for putting purpose and values back at the heart of economics.
Yeah, it's absolutely brilliant. I cannot recommend this book enough. Doughnut Economics by Kate Raworth. Her website, Kate Raworth, K-A-T-E, Raworth, RAWORTH.com, and you can tweet her at Kate Raworth. Kate, thanks so much for being with us today.
Oh, my pleasure. Thank you.
Great speaking. We'll be right back.